Some folks getting the lunch outside, and please feel free to go back and get seconds. There's plenty of food, but it's my great pleasure to be here today. My name is Prerna Singh, and I am the head of the graduate program in development, which, along with the Africa Initiative, which is headed by Professor Dan Smith in anthropology, are delighted to bring you Rachel Beatty Riedl. And I just want to say before we start that actually GPD is an interdisciplinary program for graduate students that not only provides an incredible opportunity to hear speakers like Professor Riedl, but also to apply for fellowships and to have this community of scholars and funding opportunities to support your research. And so if you're in your first, second, or third years of PhD programs in anthropology, sociology, economics, political science, sociology, history, please consider applying. Our call for applications is open. Hayden, who we have to thank and is outside, can provide you more information, and I'm available as well. And your best resource, of course, are our existing GPD fellows, of whom there are many in this room. But thank you all for coming today, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Riedl, who is the director of the Einaudi Center and the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies and professor in the Department of Government and the Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell. Prior to joining Cornell, Professor Riedl was at the Department of Political Science at Northwestern, and her research interests really in some ways epitomize a lot of what we try to do in the GPD, which is think broadly about questions of institutions, of democracy, of decentralization, and also of questions of identity politics. And Professor Riedl also has a book on religion and politics. Her most recent book was with Professor Gwyneth Mcclendon. And so for those of you who are in the program and hear me talk again and again about the importance of peer relationships, and particularly with people in your program and talking to each other, this book is co-authored with Professor Gwyneth Mcclendon, who was in the PhD program in the Department of Political Science. And so these kinds of collaborations that incubate from ideas that you have in research workshops in grad school can have these long and amazing afterlives. So just to flag that. In addition to the book From Pews to Politics, Religious Sermons and Political Representation in Africa, which came out with Cambridge University Press a few years ago, Professor Riedl also has a book, and I love the title. Again, for those of you who've heard me talk about the importance of titles that succinctly communicate the most punchy way to describe your argument, Authoritarian Origins of Democratic Party Systems, which tells you exactly what's important, counterintuitive, and why you should read the book. But in a way, Professor Riedl's work today kind of loops back to some of that by talking about the very pertinent issue of democratic erosion and bringing in lessons from Africa. So please join me in welcoming Professor Riedl again into our midst at Brown.
Thank you so much to Professor Singh for this warm welcome and invitation, and to all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to get your feedback on this particular project, which is a collaborative project and really cross-regional, and then I'll go into some detail around the African case studies and how they're driving our thinking about sources of democratic resistance and sources of resilience. So I'll talk a little bit about Malawi and Benin and Tunisia, but first I want to just introduce the broader project, which is in collaboration with Jennifer McCoy, our postdoc at Cornell, Paul Friesen, and my colleague Ken Roberts. And it's really stemming from an ongoing literature in political science and more broadly across the social sciences around democratic backsliding, and the idea that democratic backsliding and erosion is happening globally. And I think there's been a lot of attention on how that's happening, the ways in which it's occurring, where it's occurring, and debates about measurement and how we can observe it. And so this project takes that reality as a starting point, as a jumping off point, and then asks, given these potentially new or significantly increased ways of in which democratic erosion is happening, what are the interventions, the strategies, the actors, and the institutions that are in place to reverse that democratic backsliding, to be pro-democratic sources of resilience or resistance? And within that broad umbrella, undertaking the question about resistance, are a series of kind of just variation questions around different outcomes. Why have some countries reopened democratic space and others have not? Where have some countries even pushed forward those opportunities to open and deepened democracy, used moments of contestation over rights and participation and competition to push the boundaries of democracy further, whereas others have not? And where has democracy stagnated at a kind of threshold level, or where has democratic decline begun but then leveled off so that it didn't go further into a very deep level of autocratic control? So these are a set of broad research questions, and we take the question first and foremost of how do we observe the universe of cases, right? So where do we know that democratic erosion is happening? And from democratic erosion, how do we know where democratic resistance, successful democratic resistance is happening? So first and foremost, we know there are many debates about the degree of democratic erosion, where it's happening in the world. And so we look at all of the indices of democracy, and we find that across all of these indices, there is significant agreement in terms of the overlap of the findings, which is that there is democratic erosion. And it's not universal, certainly it's not happening everywhere, but it is happening in places that social scientists in particular had potentially thought kind of that can't happen here, right? Advanced industrial democracies, long-standing, well-established democracies. We see significant democratic erosion happening in those cases. And so that then leads to a set of questions about how do we define and measure where backsliding cases are happening so that we can define and measure and observe where resistance is happening. One of the key findings or takeaways from this observational kind of landscape part of the project is that what is happening right now in terms of democratic erosion is significantly different from earlier waves of autocratization that perhaps focused largely on war, civil war, interstate war, civil war, and military coups, right? That conflict and military conflict was a driving cause of erosion of democracy. What we see right now is that, and picking up on, these are historical waves, it's not a new process, but the concentration and the frequency of this process is what is, I would argue, new, is that democratic backsliding itself is an endogenous process. It's coming from elected leaders, from nominally democratic institutions, the courts, the legislatures, and the presidency, the executive, and using legal channels themselves in order to weaken vertical and horizontal accountability. So vertical accountability is accountability from the voters, to what degree are voters' rights and representation limited, and horizontal accountability is accountability from other branches, to what degree do the judicial institutions and legislative institutions themselves become captured and agents of democratic erosion, right? Democratic, autocratic concentration. So often these institutions themselves are weaponized and repurposed no longer as democratic institutions. But what that does, it makes it very difficult for citizens who would like to vote for democracy and who want democracy to thrive, and for observers to pinpoint a particular moment where something crosses a threshold, right? So we see that it's absolutely an incremental process, and one that happens across different institutions at different times. So it's not as though all horizontal institutions of accountability are simultaneously captured, and sometimes maybe the judiciary is captured first, and then there's a sequence by which the legislature is captured second and repurposed towards autocratic ends, because the judiciary has made it illegal for certain types of opposition parties to run. So then it's very easy in a second round to capture the legislature and to use it as a tool of autocratic concentration. But often this kind of democratic erosion might be difficult to recognize, and that's often one of the tools of erosion itself, that it might be a kind of erosion by stealth, and there might be no clear line of demarcation between democracy and autocracy itself. So we see these multiple sequences and pathways and not one particular route by which we could say this is a clear objective indicator. So one of the other key takeaways around how this process of erosion is happening differently is that democracy is not necessarily threatened from the outside by those who fear losing, but rather by those who have won and want to increase their power and to maintain their power by increasing that executive control. And so the challenge is both from those who have won democratically and from populist leaders who may claim to have a democratic mandate of representing the people. So these are challenges because those who would be autocratizers are very democratic in some of their language, in their processes, and in their rhetoric, which also makes it this kind of endogenous process. The threat to democracy is so in part coming from these executive incumbents and their use of institutions. It's also coming from new forms of polarization. So we might have thought of polarization as a kind of ideological divide from left to right. We might have thought of polarization as accompanying a kind of affective version of liking versus disliking on a broad scale. And we might have thought of polarization as a kind of us versus them binary camp with kind of multiple antagonisms. And what is very dangerous about this kind of polarization and dividing citizens and members of the nation into an us versus them antagonism is that it leads to a particular kind of pernicious polarization. A polarization that can break down governance, that leads governance to not be social public policy oriented because it's no longer for the whole. It leads to a pernicious polarization that justifies the ends of democratization as a means to gaining the kind of representation that one side versus the other might prefer. So pernicious polarization itself is a justifying of de-democratizing of institutions in order to say our side is the democratic side and therefore we must win at all costs. Right? So this kind of pernicious polarization is about how citizens within the polity see each other and see themselves, but in particular it has these very negative consequences for democratic resilience and strategies and supporting democracy as a whole. So is this process of polarization top-down versus bottom-up? We have a lot of questions about this in terms of focusing in on the key actors who are driving this kind of polarization and democratic erosion. And we see that top-down polarization led by elites, the rhetoric of elites, the strategies of division of elites, is absolutely prevalent in pernicious polarization and democratic erosion. So elites have a key role to play and are responsible for the ways in which they mobilize a kind of antagonistic vision of the citizenry. At the same time, citizens are not off the hook. Voters, every day, the masses, right? All of us are a part of providing constraints on our elected leaders, on political parties who are seeking our vote, on civil society organizations who are attempting to mobilize us in one direction or another. Citizens themselves are the backbone of how the polarization systems mobilize and allow would-be autocratizers to be elected. So citizens, bottom up and top down, are working together in interaction. So polarized voters, especially kind of strong partisans and when citizens feel they're highly threatened in this us versus them antagonism, are more likely to support anti-democratic policies and candidates. So is it about structure? Is it about institutions? Is it about agency? We find that there are all three that are driving this kind of pernicious polarization. And so when we look across the world today, the kinds of redistributive bargains that drove a kind of middle-class, advanced industrial democracy logic around democracy and capitalist development working together has broken down in our globalized world of incredible amounts of inequality. We have inequality, obviously, within countries that is increasing, but we have a global level of inequality that is driving and connected to the kind of pernicious polarization and threats that citizens and voters feel. So there are economic, demographic, and technological changes that are contributing to this pernicious polarization. And at the same time, we see that democratic successes, the value of democratic institutions that have been expanding across what we might call the third wave, or since the first wave, slowly, incrementally, certainly with pushback. But those democratic successes themselves of expanding the franchise, expanding a set of rights, expanding the set of rights that people consider to be rights, all of these democratic successes themselves have caused and are drivers of a reactionary pushback. And we see that across the world around questions of women's rights and participations, LGBTQ rights and participation, right? Who is defined as a citizen and what roles do they have in participation and competition and a right to representation and their inclusion in social good and public policy. So in part, yes, please. Yes.
So it's the globalization that's driving the concurrent level of polarization across the world. Is that the argument about why polarization is increasing among so many countries at this moment?
I think that on the structural level, yes, I would say that the degree to which globalization is concentrating inequality and not allowing for the level of kind of redistributive compromise within any given country is a driver of this kind of pernicious polarization. Yeah, exactly. And then the third is institutions, right? That consensus democracies themselves are less polarized than majoritarian democracies. We see the prevalence of majoritarian democracies and the way in which being able to mobilize a particular majority, however it is defined, can be an electoral channel to limiting the rights and participation of a very slim minority. And then the role of agency, right? So this kind of top-down question and the way in which polarizing political entrepreneurs can catalyze democratic backsliding. That it's often in the interest, particularly, again, in an era of global media that doesn't have many bounds on what it can say and what it can do, that polarizing political entrepreneurs can generate electoral returns from those types of strategies. And so in this interaction of structures, institutions, and agency, we see the kind of pernicious polarization increase and contribute to democratic erosion across the world. So this is the setup for our project in terms of thinking about, okay, democratic erosion is happening. It's happening in these new ways through this endogenous and institutional set of options for leaders. And so from that world that we live in, then the question is, how do we learn about strategies for democratic resistance? So in order to do so, the team that I introduced to you earlier selected 15 case studies from the broader universe of cases and tried to differentiate according to the top set of cases that are the set of recovery cases. So Brazil, Ecuador, Malawi, Moldova, and South Korea are all cases in which backsliding happened. So first of all, you have to be at a level of being a democracy. Backsliding happens. And then in these set of cases, some element of resistance and recovery occurred. So those are a set of success cases that we want to understand the processes by which that happened. Then we have selected a set of partial backsliding cases, ones in which there has been a significant degree of democratic erosion, and then that democratic erosion has, in some cases, leveled off to some degree, right? There hasn't been a further erosion yet. That's not to say that it won't happen, that it can't happen by any means, but that there has been some forces that have forestalled that further backsliding or have pushed back. So these are also really instructive cases for us to think about, why is there partial backsliding and not full backsliding into complete autocracy? And what were the factors that have been limiting on other efforts? And then we have a set of cases of severe backsliding, right, where there were really significant jumps in terms of its total decline from various starting points. So some of these started off as, rather weak democracies. Others started off as more robust democracies, and all have experienced a very significant backsliding. So these are cases in which we want to look at what strategies of resistance were tried and what factors blocked those strategies of resistance, what did not make them successful, right? Now, one thing I want to note here is that when we selected the cases just a year ago, we had 5 in each category. And then we see movement in particular from the partial backsliding category. So we had Poland. Now we've seen that the opposition political parties have won in Poland. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work to do ahead to re-democratize captured or weaponized institutions, right? But that we see Poland may be in the recovery case, right? And a really important electoral transition happened. and that several of the countries were downgraded. Benin and Tunisia both started in the partial backsliding category and have further eroded. So it's interesting to us that the partial backsliding category itself, and Indonesia as well, may be further eroding. But partial backsliding does not seem to be a very stable equilibrium, right? It's a place in which there's a lot of contestation going back and forth. It's a set of countries and processes by which we can learn a lot, because there's a lot in contestation in this moment, but it's probably not a kind of coherent category that is likely to maintain over time. So how do we get those particular cases, and how do we think about what we're observing? So there are a few key coding decisions that I want to highlight because they're significant to according to this broader debate that's happening in political science in particular around how we measure democratic erosion and how significant of a phenomenon is it. So the first question that we pay attention to is what countries and periods should be considered. So what threshold of democratic erosion do you have to have, a 0.2 or a 0.3 on these different scales in order to be considered that erosion is actually happening? And then what democracy data sets and indicators should be used. So we use an amalgamation, but then we focus in on using varieties of democracy, the Liberal Democracy Index in particular, because the liberal aspect of the Liberal Democracy Index is quite important around the inclusion of rights, the idea of what civil liberties individuals have, and that broader sense that goes beyond technical focus on elections and participation. And then what countries are considered a democracy? As I said, in order to be in this universe of cases, one already has to be a democracy as a starting point. So we're not looking at autocratization, further degrading of rights within a country that's already authoritarian, because we believe that's a different set of processes. Actors have different levers or tools at their disposal, more or less constrained space. And so we're really looking at countries that already had a practice of democracy in which erosion happened, and then how that resistance happens in that context. How much of a decline in democracy score is backsliding, and are there events that disqualify cases from experiencing backsliding? So if there's something like there is a civil war or some kind of conflict, we would take that case out of our universe of cases of possible observation. Not to say that democratic erosion didn't happen there, it certainly did, but that's not the set of processes that we're interested in observing. That would be a different type of mechanism. Okay. So in exploring this resistance to democratic backsliding, we focus then on the role of the electorate. That's all of us. We're all voters, right? That citizens have a say, and whether or not they feel mobilized, whether or not they feel that they care about democracy, that they should anchor their vote around a pro-democracy mobilization, is a really significant element of holding leaders accountable. And then we also focus on civil society, the potential for civil society to be organized, how deep their linkages are to the electorate, how deep their linkages are to international forces, and how deep their linkages are to the leaders, right? How is civil society itself organized, and what is the character and content of that civil society? So one of our key takeaways that I'll come to later is that none of these should be considered by their very nature pro-democracy. Right? These are all contested spaces in and of themselves. So the electorate, we can't guarantee, is necessarily oriented towards democracy, right? Civil society, as we know, could go in both ways. You have a strong and vibrant civil society. As Sherry Berman taught us long ago, it may well be a very anti-democratic civil society, right? Depending on how it's linked to society itself and to other organizations. The role of political parties. How are they organized? How strongly institutionalized are they? What is their relationship to the kind of pernicious polarization I was discussing? And then institutional arenas. These as well. We know they can be captured and repurposed as tools of democratic erosion, or they can be the buttressing forces of democratic resistance and resilience. So thinking about the judicial arena, the legislative arena, and then in particular the bureaucracy, right? How does the state itself serve as an agent of authoritarian decline, or as a real force of democratic resistance from within? And then the role of the media, a very complicated space and one that interacts across the other institutional spaces. So civil society itself, let me just begin by saying that civil society is, as I was saying, not uniformly democratic. It's this site of contestation. It is never homogeneous, and it should be representative and mobilizing across a variety of different actors. So what are the positive strategies around civil society pro-democracy mobilization? The importance of durable organizational networks beyond kind of episodic social media and protest moments, right? Those can be very attention grabbing. They're important at a particular moment to be able to mobilize. But the durability of social organizational links and civil society broader infrastructure across time is absolutely critical, because so much of this incremental democratic erosion is behind the scenes. It's often technical, right? It's the things that nobody's paying attention to until you realize that the rule was passed and you missed that opportunity. So civil society's ability to kind of be ever vigilant and ever organized and responsive, and then actually charting an agenda, not just responding to, but setting an agenda, is absolutely critical. And then when it's organized around democracy, of course. And then building broad democratic coalitions. So the ability of that organized, institutionalized civil society to connect to political parties or to connect to other types of civic groups and not being insular. So whether or not the civil society themselves can form coalitions across civil society that might overcome otherwise pre-existing divisions. So we know that political parties might have a variety of different reasons why they don't normally align. Civil society too might be focused on very different areas and not normally see themselves as coalition partners. But the ability to supersede those pre-existing divisions when the fight on the table is around democracy as an umbrella issue is a really key factor for civil society as a site of democratic contestation to overcome other types of fragmentation and polarization in society. The challenge, of course, for civil society is to avoid state co-optation. Now, this will come up in a lot of the cases that I'm talking about today in Africa, where civil society leaders are often pulled into being political party leaders or members of the state bureaucracy at high levels. And so civil society itself gets hollowed out, where it's often successful in a particular moment. Then the later stages, it gets hollowed out as a consequence of its own success. Civil society can also be regulated when these democratic erosion periods are happening, and so limited by regulations from above. And then another challenge for civil society in terms of their strategies is how do they go about being pro-democratic and organizing in favor of democracy without exacerbating existing polarization in society. So that relates to the goal of building broad-based democratic coalitions, to being inclusive, but it's very easy for civil society to become part of this pernicious polarization when the pernicious polarization is a kind of us versus them, democracy on this side, anti-democracy on that side, but everyone thinks that their side is the democratic side. Okay, then thinking about the role of political parties, because this is, kind of my bread and butter, so I have to focus on political parties. But political parties themselves certainly try to preempt co-optation by the incumbent. This is one of the major factors that helps to contribute to democratic resistance. That when political parties are organizationally strong, when they have internal democracy, right? What are their practices from within to be able to really focus on their practices of selecting leaders, how they include different members of the party themselves, and that opposition parties themselves, when they're out of power and experiencing a moment of democratic erosion, that they can use subnational areas of control. Maybe they control a city, maybe it's a federal system and they control a state, to use those as bastions of democratic governance and resources to be able to then project themselves back to the national level of democratic influence. Also, having a role in the backbench of the legislature is an important role for opposition political parties to play. So often we see, in the negative strategies, if political parties try to boycott an election, we understand the impetus for which they might want to boycott. They say the rules are not fair, we're going to lose, it's totally rigged, we don't endorse this process of democratic erosion, and so we want to boycott. That isn't important rhetoric and an important narrative to put out there, but actually boycotting has been, we find, is a really counterproductive strategy, because then political parties the opposition parties that are pro-democratic are completely blocked out. They have no seats in the legislature, right? They have no seats at the subnational level. They have nothing that they can control, and they lose access to the state and other levers, as well as an important discussion point of horizontal accountability. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the case studies so that we have time to discuss, and then I'm going to summarize with a few key takeaways. So just bear with me as I go through Okay, this is one. Before I get into the 3 case studies, I just want to highlight how we're thinking about the series of sequences and pathways that allow us to understand more precisely which levers and which actors are most available for democratic resistance. So what I want to suggest is that the area in blue, these are the pathways of democratic erosion. And as I started out by suggesting, democratic erosion doesn't happen according to one sequence alone, right? There are multiple ways in which democratic erosion can happen. It can happen in the legislative capture sense, where a political party wins the presidency and the legislature, even by a very slim majority, let's say 50.5%, right? Or even in the United States case, by a minority, you might win the presidency using the Electoral College, and then one of the houses because of the level of unrepresentativeness across territory. But in one form or another, you capture the tools of the legislature, right? So in that moment of democratic erosion, the legislature itself can be used to pass anti-democratic legislation. This can mean limitations on the media, limitations on civil society, limitations on political parties and who's able to register to compete in the next elections, which candidates are able to run, right? There are a whole host of ways in which the legislature itself can pass anti-democratic legislation that can limit these other branches, right? So let's imagine that that's the first step in democratic erosion. If you're on this pathway, there are some domains of resistance that are more available to you than others, right? The legislature is pretty blocked off for a particular electoral period. That's not going to be the key domain of democratic resistance, even if it helps if you have some opposition there, right? Some opposition parties that may still be able to put up a fight rhetorically, but institutional resistance is more limited in that legislative capture scenario, whereas electoral contestation and societal resistance becomes potentially more important in this pathway as sites of focus for democratic resistance. In an auto golpe scenario, right? These are all 3 of these in the left-hand boxes are scenarios by which the executive is seeking to concentrate power, to aggrandize, right? To limit horizontal accountability. In the auto golpe scenario, so this is Tunisia, you have a presidential coup whereby they just get rid of and disband the legislature. So that no longer exists. Maybe they don't allow the judiciary to convene, right? So this is a very drastic, not incremental pathway of democratic erosion, one that's much more obvious to observers. So institutional resistance is largely off the table because those institutions are suspended. So therefore, the societal resistance is often put into a much more aggressive or visible set of tactics of union mobilization, strikes, general protests, etc. Because the within institutional route is blocked, so you have to go extra institutional in this scenario. And you may try to exploit weaknesses within the autocratic ruling bloc. Because this is such a dramatic scenario, you likely have softliners and hardliners within that ruling party. And so trying to divide from within the ruling party might be a much more effective strategy than where you still have opposition in institutional sites. The plebiscitary overrides. This is a key strategy whereby institutional resistance is still on the table, where the citizenry themselves can work through the legislature, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. And then when you see exclusionary nationalism, I mean, India is a key case here, right, where you have the ability to follow the BJP is able to follow a very electoral pathway. They don't have interest in limiting participation among the majority of the voters. They don't have interest in necessarily limiting elections because they're able to win power through elections, but then limit rights, right? So the main focus of the democratic erosion is on the erosion of civil liberties, right? The space for association and for rights to be provided to the entire citizenry. So in this sense, institutional resistance is absolutely on the table. That's a key side of contestation. And opposition, yeah, please.
So this erosion of civil liberties and the way that exclusionary nationalism goes, I'm just trying to kind of understand the levels of the analytic,
Yep.
are pretty similar to legislative capture, right, in some ways, because you can even imagine that, or how are they, like, exclusionary nationalism, because it's the kind of electoral route, means that it's not legislative capture, it's legislative dominance. I was just kind of curious about that.
Correct, exactly. So this is really dominance. So you might have like the two-thirds majority or the ability to do anything you want with the legislature, whereas in exclusionary nationalism, maybe you only have a slim majority. But the key focus here, so the institutional domain is similar except for potentially the role of the legislature. But the key focus is on the tactics of erosion itself, right? The creation of identities and the ways in which, rather than an institutional fight here, you have an identity fight in this. And so that is the mobilization. And then on the elite collusion side, what's really interesting here is that the elite collusion pathway to democratic erosion is premised on the idea it's necessary to have a certain fluidity and weakness of the political party system and structure. So Indonesia and Benin are key cases. And in those key cases, we see that elites tend to bandwagon around the winner, right? So where you have a particular party that might win, everyone kind of goes into the winning coalition, and then you lose opportunities for a true opposition to hold them accountable. In some ways, that has sustained a democratic bargain in both Indonesia and Benin for decades, and those are very important kind of cases of democracy with a limit of equality, but they are also vulnerable to this very kind of to any particular elite within that collusive bargain trying to consolidate power, trying to move beyond the bargain and to accumulate and aggrandize from within. So those are a set of pathways, and I just want to kind of lay those out in terms of thinking about what the different cases represent and what institutional scenarios are available and which actors are key. So let me talk a little bit about Malawi, Benin, and Tunisia briefly, and then we can open it up for your questions. So in Malawi, so this is a Liberal Democracy Index. You can see this is a case of democratic success and recovery. The Liberal Democracy Index, interestingly, in Malawi has not really declined significantly despite these very important challenges to democracy in Malawi because the successes were all in the moment. So the average year stays fairly steady, but there were these deep kind of crises of democratic representation and use of institutions around which society and those institutions responded. And so you never see a kind of sustained bump and then a major recovery except in 2019. So democracy in Malawi has not consolidated in a sense, and it has been kind of stagnating at this fairly low level of quality, but it has been able to maintain itself, which is very significant. Public support for democracy, the yellow line, has stayed steady, has had its ups and downs, but has stayed very dominant in terms of citizen preferences for democratic competition in contrast to other types of government in the bottom. And so let me just tell you about a couple of key episodes in Malawi that demonstrate how these different institutional routes and resistance actors were critical to democratic resistance. So in Malawi, in 2002, the president had the opportunity to run for a third term, was seeking third term. And tabled a bill in Parliament to be able to give himself the power to do so. But the bill failed after the legislature said, no, we're not going to give you the ability to run for the third term. So the president continued to try to vie for a third term through other ways, referendum, choosing a kind of successor that would be kind of his puppet. And yet both the legislature and the electorate said no. So in these cases, we have the power of the legislature to avoid democratic erosion. Now, the kind of personalism and weak parties provided the context around which this democratic erosion happened, but also the context around which that the parties themselves were able to come together in a pro-democratic coalition that overcame individual or other kinds of divisive combinations of civil society and political parties. In the interim, there was another set of kind of limiting opportunities for rights and for political party mobilization. And so the level of protests grew up till 2011, in which the protesters themselves delivered a petition that was highlighting all of their economic grievances, their political grievances, a list of demands. And the president brought out the state security forces and repressed the population and popular protests. People were killed. And this was a really critical moment for civil society and religious leaders to respond to suggest that this was an effort, by the administration to undermine their power to take to the streets, to mobilize. In 2012, the president died in office, and so this created a moment of succession crisis. But his death was obscured from the public, withheld, and his brother attempted to circumvent constitutional succession. Eventually, the vice president was able to take office, and so the key actors in terms of overseeing this key moment of succession were the judiciary, the independent media, the civil society, and especially the military to allow for the constitutional progression of power. So then in 2019 to 2020, where we saw that little dip, was a really key moment in Malawi's kind of democratic success story, in which the elections were contested in court, and there were major street protests around the incumbent saying that he had won. They demanded that the chairperson of the Electoral Commission be fired, and then the Constitutional Court ruled that the elections had sufficient irregularities and had to be reheld. And so this was really a victory that we see by the courts, and then also the courts themselves were empowered by street protests. So we think that the way in which the courts were able to kind of stand up to the executive was really in part because of their independence, but also in part because of the level of social mobilization that pressured them to be activist courts in that sense. Okay, Benin, not a case of democratic success, but a really interesting case of democratic endurance up until 2019, where you see a steep decline. So 1989 until 2016, Benin had been this kind of flourishing democracy, a modernization, overperformer, a place with, many people would not expect democracy to survive. And there had been questions about third term, succession, all kinds of challenges along the way with former presidents. But in 2016, President Talon was elected, and the ability of a single incumbent to quickly erode democratic rights, I think, comes back to this earlier structural point about the degree to which economic concentration of power. President Talon owns the port, controls all of the revenue from the ports, and the King of Cotton controls the major export of Benin. And so the degree to which he had previously funded all of the political parties that ran and controlled resources within his own domain allowed him to overcome the prior sources of kind of institutional support for democracy and quickly go the legislative capture route. So overtook, because of the elite collusion and bandwagoning, he was able to use the legislature to pass legislation that banned opposition parties, that limited the ability of opposition parties to run for the next presidential elections, and basically blocked out opposition at all levels of municipal government, legislative, and executive contestation. They also passed a very restrictive digital law, which made the media and civil society spaces open to being imprisoned for sharing information. And so it's really a chilling period for democracy. So civil society has attempted to mobilize, but not successfully in the sense of this overwhelming capture of the judiciary and the legislature. Okay, so very briefly here so that we can get to Q&A, I also want to just describe Tunisia, which is the third kind of democratic erosion. It's the autogolpe, right? It's the self-coup by the incumbent that you see the period of steep decline in the Liberal Democracy Index that shut down the other institutions in 2021. President Said dismissed the prime minister and then disbanded the parliament. So this kind of seizure of power was in the Tunisian case a really interesting result of the kind of pernicious polarization that we're not seeing as much in Benin or Malawi, but we are seeing very much in Tunisia. And the pernicious polarization is on two fronts. One is a kind of question of elites versus the masses, a kind of question of polarization around the elite-led traditional elites versus a more populist strategy of President Said, mobilizing against the kind of traditional leaders. And then the other is around a kind of religious secular cleavage. So these are the dividing forces in society that have allowed this autogolpe to go fairly unchallenged. The unions themselves are very powerful in Tunisia, but have not strongly challenged the disbanding of democratic institutions. There have been some protests, but they have not been sustained, right? So the existing polarization of society and the kind of populist mobilization of President Said has allowed for an autogolpe without the resounding kind of social resistance that one might expect. And so this draws upon the importance of thinking about how to overcome those sources of polarization in the end. So just to conclude, there are several kind of conditions that constrain backsliding institutionally around proportionality and institutional veto points. But our silver lining to end is that even though we see that democratic erosion is happening, it's not easy for aspiring autocrats to fully dismantle democratic institutions across all of these different domains. They may be able to take over the legislature and then the judiciary, but the ability to kind of completely co-opt civil society, right? There are so many different potential reservoirs of democratic resistance that may come together that help us to understand the cases of recovery and give hope to hybrid cases or places where there has been significant erosion. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Riedl. This is, as always, a kind of great combination of analytics and empirics and a silver lining, which is not anything you ever get in an academic talk. So
Especially not about democracy.
No, especially not about democracy or Africa often, right? So this is great. So it's GPD, so we start with grad students, even though I see many of my colleagues' hands up, but very quickly we'll collect a round of graduate student questions. Please introduce yourself and then go on to more familiar. Yes?
Hi, I'm Salma. I'm a 7th year student in sociology. Great talk, Rachel. I do have a question on sort of transnational effects because the story has largely been an endogenous story. But at least in the case of, I'm thinking of the case of Malawi, it's like the Constitutional Court recalling the election happened a few years after it happened in Kenya. And there's a lot of conversation in the region when Tunisia had the sort of Arab uprising. A lot of countries in the region were sort of looking at that as an example, and then obviously sort of thinking of Trump as well and that global effect.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Carolee. I'm a 3rd year PhD student in sociology. I had a question about the civil society picture, and the way it was presented was that one of the limits on civil society playing a role in resisting backsliding, sorry, is when they're co-opted. But I wonder about considerations of how close ties between civil society actors and state actors can actually act as markers of resilience and ways in which actually you see not co-optation but movement between civil society actors and the state and political parties actually strengthening democracy and giving both actors within the state and actors in civil society greater tools to ensure that. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Danny, 2nd year PhD student in political science. So I had 2 points. One is about the role of international power. I was reading about the Sahel, the governments basically like outsourcing repression to Russia, and how like you have the fact that you have governments in the world today with enough power to support autocratic governments, if this is not a major part of the story. Or for instance, the case of Brazil, everyone thought that, I mean, the US supported the democracy and was against the coup, and everyone expected China to do the same, but because they were aligned with the government that won the election, but actually we now have evidence that they were not caring about it. So, and the second point is about the limits of judicial oversight as a source of democratic resilience, because again, the case of Brazil, you see like that was successful, but at the same time you see the structural conditions, at least from the point of view of the mass public opinion, remain the same. The power of the far right remain the same. So how much those indexes are capturing these more like latent threats to democracy and like the challenges of gauging these kind of threats at the public opinion level.
Just one more question.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Shreya. I'm a second year in political science. I know you talked about it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on the role of bureaucracy. I understand how bureaucrats can become agents of control, but I was wondering, in the second part where you're talking about strategies of resistance, what they might play, and if you have any insights.
Great. Yeah. Any other grad students as we quickly conclude our grad student round before we go on to my colleagues?
One more question?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering like how do you like identify the primary drivers of backsliding? I see you have been using the VDAM. So which specific like disaggregated indicators you're using to identify? And a follow-up question will be, so will be related to your concluding remarks. So under what conditions do you think like the aspiring autocrats, dictators could launch successfully like a backsliding, and when did they fail?
Okay, you have your hands full, but
Great.
I'm going to say maybe just a couple
Yeah,
of minutes
I'll be
because
quick.
I see Rob, Dawn, and I think Ashu as well. on the
Yes.
list.
Right, okay, perfect. So let me combine the transnational and the international question first, which is a really important point and one that I didn't touch on here at all, but absolutely across all of our case studies, international factors loom large, in some cases more than others, but even in our kind of Western Europe, or like in the case of Hungary, the relationship to the EU plays a large role. So transnational networks and international factors do play a key role. In Malawi, absolutely, international factors played an important role, in particular in where you have more donor-dependent countries. International influences can be pro-democratic, or as you mentioned, if you're turning towards, maybe China is very involved, as in Zambia, then maybe they're not putting pro-democracy pressure. So I would say international itself is also another site of incredible importance, but we shouldn't assume that it's pro-democratic or anti-democratic in nature. There are a couple of key studies. So one, Steph Haggard at UCSD and colleagues are working on a project that shows that countries that are part of a regional organization, like ECOWAS, the Organization of West African States, or SADC, or others, where the majority of those countries that belong to that bloc are authoritarian, it has kind of democratic erosion effects for other members in that bloc. So kind of who are your neighbors and what are their expectations, we see as a very important factor. And then also thinking about the ability to kind of leapfrog one's own domestic court system in particular, to be able to, if the courts themselves are captured, sometimes pro-democracy civil society groups or rights groups will put a case at the regional organizational level, at the ECOWAS courts, or at a higher level court to try to get a ruling against democratic erosion and restriction of rights within one's own country. So there are different tools and levers, but international influence and experience, as you mentioned, the Arab Spring, like the importance of the Kenyan constitutional, or the rerun of the Kenyan elections, the court making a call that the elections need to be redone, autocrats are learning from each other's strategies, and so are democrats, right? So the international arena, again, it has lessons for both of us, for both sides, and the tools of communication are very accessible. So it's an important factor. It doesn't go only one direction. Then in terms of thinking about the role of civil society.
And maybe we just like
Yeah.
choose one
Okay,
question.
perfect. Okay, okay, I'll go to the civil society question and clump it together with the bureaucracy to cheat. So civil society, absolutely, right? The ability of the civil society to tie into state power, again, it depends on how the civil society itself is oriented, what its goals are, whether pro or anti-democratic, and then in particular it ties into the bureaucracy in terms of thinking about what elements. Bureaucracy is such an interesting space because it can, like if we think about James Scott and Weapons of the Weak, right, like it can slow walk things that it doesn't agree with. If it's trying to uphold governance and rights just in a bureaucratic administrative manner, the executive or the democratic eroders may be putting pressures on the bureaucracy to be tools of this trying to capture it, but the extent to which they don't implement or have kind of their own administrative structures, they can be real forces to buttress democratic procedure and not implement what might be very discriminatory aspects that this incumbent is trying to place. That's not always the case, right? They could be the first ones to be captured because maybe the bureaucracy is the first ones who are replaced, right? So it depends again on these kind of pathways and what institutional points of erosion are happening in what sequence.
That's super interesting. Okay, so we're going to do one concluding round of a lot of questions. We have Professor Dawn Brancati, who's in the Watson Institute, which is where we are today. Dawn, and then we have Rob,
So my question is more, so thank you for your presentation, it's really deep and informative. My question is more of a comment, not a question. Is your flowchart was really helpful and informative and I think innovative and new, and I think it could be more useful theoretically for others to research if it wasn't what seems like rather inductively through your cases, inductively rather than deductively for other scholars to use. So it might be one of a project that you might want to work in the future, and I think it would resolve a lot of the questions that many people are coming up with in their Q&As and their real Qs.
Exactly. No, that's definitely the next step. That's the research agenda ahead. So thank you. Stay tuned.
You didn't pay me for that.
Professor.
Thanks, Rachel. This is really great. So I'm just sort of thinking through the case of Malawi. I'm wondering how you adjudicate between two interpretations of what's basically a flat line on the VDIM score. So one way to interpret this, and with a lot going on under the surface, right?
Totally.
So one way to interpret this is a very fragile regime that is undergoing constant stress tests and managing to survive, but by the skin of its teeth, right? So we should think of this as being a fundamentally fragile regime. Another way to think of it is this is a fundamentally resilient regime that is undergoing constant stress tests, and yet every time is surviving, maybe not thriving, but surviving every time. And I think a lot of us are thinking about this also in the context of like the 2020 election in the U.S., right, where some people see it as evidence of a democracy that's in deep trouble and very fragile, and others seeing it as evidence of actually very robust institutions that can constrain, would be authoritarian. So I wonder how how should we think about those two interpretations that seem perfectly consistent, both of them with that graph.
Correct. Great. So as an institutionalist, sorry. Yeah, I just want to jump into that.
So one comment/question on the outcome variable side, and one on the IV side. Let's begin with the IV. I do think this distinction that you conceptually draw between consensus democracies, by which I think you mean PR. I don't think you mean fully consociational, because there are very few of them.
Right.
You mean basically proportionality, PR. And there's so many of them, right, in so many cases there. Versus majoritarian. I think this is a good way to think about what might promote erosion or not. But within majoritarian, would you split the cases between, at least conceptually, start with parliamentary versus presidential. Both are majoritarian but in different ways. And one may easily allow legislative capture. Parliamentary does. Presidential may not. But the case of PR limiting erosion, it's very attractive conceptually, but you may have to deal with some puzzling cases. Israel of late, which is PR. Austria of late, which is PR. Which is the sort of, which was consociational under Leiphart, right? I don't know whether it's fully consociational still. I think Switzerland might fit very well at many ways because that was also in the original consociational list. So anyway, the Austrias of the world and the Israels of the world will create I don't believe in 0 or 1 classifications. It's 0 to 1, it should be on the scale, right? So I do believe still Israel may be around 0.5 if you want to count it that way. And Austria is probably dropping below 0.5 or something. But not 0 or 1. We can't do it. That political analysis cannot be. Only political theorists do that, I think, in political analysis. Otherwise, 0 and 1 should be avoided, unless there is an absolute case for that, 0 or 1. So thoughts on that, presidential versus parliamentary and the majoritarian, and these puzzling PR cases that are beginning to emerge. On the DV side, when you gave us the data on erosion, you actually picked, I think, only the liberal democracy score of VDEM. You didn't pick the electoral democracy score. There must be a reason for that, which you can tell us, but fundamentally there's a problem with the VDEM electoral democracy versus liberal democracy score. Electoral democracy score of VDEM has historically, and I have critiqued and not yet published that critique yet, but they're aware of my critique. The electoral democracy index includes freedom of speech and freedom of association, which is, from a political theory perspective, very troubling, which will typically come under liberal democracy. Their liberal democracy is electoral democracy index plus rights of minorities, which is a liberal issue indeed, plus judicial checks on authority, which is another interesting liberal issue, and plus some kind of some other checks and balances. Anyway, checks and balances and minority rights is basically the addition. So the question would be, why are you going for liberal democracy score as opposed to electoral democracy score? Shravorsky would criticize you for that, because he's absolutely into elections and nothing else, right? But I think Shravorsky is wrong, and you're right. But we want to know why.
Yeah.
Why are you going towards liberal democracy
Thank
score?
you,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Okay, I am going to make sure that we get all our questions in,
Great,
and
great,
maybe we try to
yes.
keep our
you.
questions kind of a little bit concise. Professor Heller.
Thank you, Riedl. This is great. I just have a very quick question. It strikes me you have degrees of democratic decline, but you also have types. So you're using backsliding, which I assume is Levitsky and Ziblatt. And that's really a story of politicians behaving badly and not respecting the norms and not respecting the guardrails. But one of your structural causes was reaction. And it strikes me that reaction is a completely different category. And that we shouldn't lump them together. So just to use the example of Brazil, Bolsonaro didn't get into power and then try to stay in power. From the get-go, he had an illiberal project, right, and was celebrating military dictatorship and was a response really to 16 years of the Beatty being in power, trying to dismantle those gains. And likewise, you know, Modi had an illiberal project before he became prime minister, and it was a Hindu nationalist, ethno-nationalist project, very deeply illiberal. So should we be differentiating between backsliding and reactions? Because they strike me as quite different.
Great,
Okay, sorry, wait.
Awesome.
A couple more maybe.
Oh, yeah, no,
If
please.
that's all
That's what I'm here
Oh,
for,
so
great.
Rachel, thanks so much for the talk. I have two sort of questions. I'll try to make them brief. So one thing that I think a lot of people who study African politics is concerned about is the repeated reliance on courts to adjudicate election results. But because given that there is seemingly a lot higher level of polarization, partisan polarization in many of these countries, that when courts basically decide in one way or the other, that fundamentally erodes trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect democracy themselves. Yet the recourse for electoral fraud or electoral irregularities often falls in the purview of the courts, right? So how do we think about sort of that dilemma? The second is sort of a measurement question I think taps into what Rob sort of pointed at. I really have a hard time thinking about what the liberal democracy index is capturing, especially in these moments of when the courts are intervening, right? So should we say, oh, electoral fraud happened, but the institutions were able to constrain that electoral fraud, so democracy is sound? Or should we say, this massive electoral fraud happened, that should somehow reflect in how we think about the soundness or the strength of democracy in that country, and think of corrective action by institutions as a separate thing that should be considered.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna very quickly add on,
Yeah.
just to say that, the one what I find really exciting is that of course we know so much about democratic erosion, is it backsliding, is it an illiberal project, but it's also like, how does resistance link to kind of resilience, but also
Yes.
to resistance?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a difference here, because in a way what Rob and Danny are pushing you to is like, is that resilience, or is that actually a challenge? But I think what is very clear in terms of like resilience and survival are kind of the two sides of the same coin. What is not the two sides of the same coin and seems a little analytically distinct to me is resistance, especially in the way that it takes the form of popular resistance. And so I'm wondering whether you can kind of actually distinguish those, because you began to say resilience and resistance together.
Right.
So to me, survival is the antonym of resilience, right? And resistance is something else. And I wonder whether in that analytic you could say that to me it's really interesting, what are the domains of democratic erosion that lead to resistance? I find it really fascinating in India that what really prompted resistance, the kind of, people coming out, thousands of people coming out onto the streets, was the amendment of the Citizenship that Act. Right, so it's and then also I would want to know, what is that trigger for the Arab Spring? And so what kind of erosion, what are the domains in which erosion happens that then prompts resistance in terms of popular resistance, and what are the domains in which the resilience survival thing is happening? And maybe that's more courts. And I think this gets to Shreya's point about, the courts are kind of part of the state. So when resistance happens that is within the state, is it this resilience survival dialectic? And if it's happening on the streets, is that very clearly a resistance dynamic? So I think that there's something there analytically that you could really kind of also get these really rich empirical studies to speak to. I laugh because you've gotten really, I think, great feedback, but I'm going to give you 2 minutes to respond.
Perfect. No, this is incredible. Obviously, so
but hopefully opening it up to other conversations. And Rachel's here today and tomorrow. So if this sparks a conversation, and if you want to get a one-on-one, please email Hayden.
That's right.
You get 2 minutes. And
exactly. No, this is so rich because obviously it's a project that's has a future. So let me just say, so how I've been thinking about resilience versus resistance is absolutely as two analytically separate things, but maybe maybe that's not the end of how I should be thinking about it. So resilience to me, in terms of my priors, are about the structural or institutional forces that might block democratic erosion in the first place, or might allow it to get to partial but not full. So they're the kind of institutional forces like PR, or a very strong and independent judiciary that exist already in place, right? Whereas resistance I see as an active set of strategies. And so to me it's about the kind of the agency and the temporalness of those strategies that puts them in the resistance camp. But but I would like to think about that further because maybe that's not the end point of this distinction. But we do make that point a little bit in our most recent world politics piece about resistance versus resilience, and so that could be thought out further. And then I want to just, because a couple of the questions like touched on this in terms of what is a steady state, right, and what does that imply, and it builds on Prerna's question around what are the sources of resilience, and Ashu's question about like the role of PR or majoritarian. And so to me it seems as though a steady state can mean many things in terms of the pathways, right? And it absolutely could be the fact that there are weak institutions and you don't have strong sources of resilience, so you're always on the brink of democratic collapse, but maybe you have strong sources of resistance and civil society is willing to be mobilized and it's pro-democratically organized. And so those are your sources of resistance that can be called upon in moments of crisis to be this kind of interactive moment of support. Whereas where you have a kind of, if the other scenario is, you know, democracy is fundamentally solid and these are, you know, test points that show how solid it is. I mean, I think that's a sign of strong institutions of vertical and horizontal accountability. And that would be probably, we would see that as starting from a higher point of democracy on our scales, right? We would also expect that in places where you have strong sources of resilience, if democratic erosion is happening, it's happening much more gradually. So I think there's a temporal aspect as well, whereas where you're kind of teetering on the brink and you have these weak institutions, democracy could plunge, but maybe you can recover it because you have those reservoirs of resistance that could be mobilized, as Prerna was suggesting, which could trigger, you know, those sources of resistance to be called to action. Where you have neither, then you just have a super steep decline, right? So that's absolutely why I think the interaction is key on a sequence front, on an interaction of institutions to actors front. And that's where I think, you know, the pathways can be further developed analytically to tell us something much more kind of, yeah, going beyond or kind of, this is what we see, like this is off the table in a particular case, in a particular place, but to kind of come out with some more general sense of the analysis around what could come out of that.
Rina, would you allow just one line here?
One line.
One line. Is the DV pathways or DV democratic erosion?
The DV is success or failure in democratic resistance.
Okay.
Or degrees of success or failure, right? And which actors are doing that.
Well, I just want to thank you, Professor Riedl, for this thought-provoking conversation. You kept us 15 minutes over time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Dan Smith, for co-sponsoring this. Please apply for GBD fellowships, and we also have an amazing set of modules, including with Professor Danny Choi, on doing exactly this kind of multi-method, deep dive research designs. They're free for grad students. They happen for a week in May. We have one on text analysis and we have one on research design with Danny. And so, you know, you'll be getting lots of emails, but sign up. These are great opportunities. And if you would like a one-on-one to pursue any of these conversations, please email Hayden. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your rich feedback and questions.